Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to thank you for joining us today. This is the second session of our seminar, Deanthrocentric Materialism and the Politics of Matter, itself part of a wider project entitled Humanities After Humans. So today's session is entitled Bodies That Matter. And the three talks that we'll hear today all invite us to think about matter as a way of deconstructing hegemonic forms of existence. So I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping as usual. We're planning to have Q&A session at the end of the three talks. And you can write your questions directly in the chat and we'll ask them for you, or you can simply raise your hand at the end to ask a question yourself. I have to apologize for Estelle Muraille, one of the co-organizers, and Daniel Carr, who was supposed to chair this session, because for actually quite good personal reasons, they won't be able to join us today. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Tina Sikka, who's a lecturer in media and cultural studies at Newcastle University. Her research draws on critical and feminist studies of science and technology to examine climate change and health and nutrition science. She also does work in the areas of critical race theory, sexuality studies, and social theory. Her most recent book, published by Springer Press, is titled Climate Technology, Gender and Justice, the Standpoint of the Vulnerable. So Tina, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can have you in full screen whenever you want.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm going to be talking about a paper I wrote sort of at the beginning phase of lockdown in Newcastle. So I would say probably around this time last year. And I started working on it. And what I started to try to apply was a feminist new materialism approach to the study of objects that were significant to what was happening. And so what I ended up writing was this idea of, how can we think about the objects that have become important at this particular point in time. And I looked specifically at toilet rolls, which was sort of the object that was, sought after, and also face masks. And I'm going to talk about toilet rolls just because it's, for time. But what I do in the talk is just give a little brief overview of feminist new materialism, but really looking at the object of a toilet roll, whose agentic power, I contend, is embedded in this larger assemblage of COVID. So the reason why I took this approach was that I thought that feminist theorizing and the approach offered by new materialism allowed us a way in to look at what was happening in a non-linear way. So drawing on concepts like nature culture and interactions and agential cuts and hybrids and assemblages, terms like nomadic subjects, there was just a lot of scope there to examine what was happening. And trying to think about the ways in which the human and the natural world were connected to each other and how neoliberal capitalism fit in as well. And so I wanted to find a way in which to reveal some of the myopic and exploitative ways in which we relate to the natural and the non-human. And so the agential cut that I made was with toilet paper. I looked at it in terms of COVID-19. The abject, hoarding behaviors, and the vulnerable. And this idea of agential cuts, Karen Barad puts together, is a sort of boundary-making practice where we're able to stabilize entities that exist within these really messy discursive assemblages. So we're cutting apart together in one move. And so after talking about this in terms of the toilet roll in a sort of basic way, I'll talk about some of the conflicts and social fissures that the assemblage exposes. So the toilet roll is this mundane, everyday object that everyone uses, whose agency as an object has been enacted by COVID-19 in some interesting ways. It reveals a number of things about how we relate to self and other, how we regulate and manage our identities, and how institutions, states, and objects form these networks of interrelationship that can impede or support forms of resistance. Although I don't talk about COVID-19 sort of outside of this idea of a nature culture, it is, a zoonotic virus, potentially likely emerged and jumped species at a wet market in Wuhan, China, late 2019, first detected in pneumonia patients, but it's taken on a trajectory that has been, quite unexpected. And our public understandings of the virus has been to sort of re-binarize the human-nature relationship, where the virus itself is raced and exploited for nationalist ends, science is hived off into spheres of expertise removed from the public, and public engagement is really, made that much more difficult. And so feminist materialism is really illuminating the way in which, or a way in which, to reconceptualize the relation between humans and non-humans, both living and non. It's been used to study things like prosthetics, media, nature ecologies, and atoms. And it's really the centrality of things being entangled, that we can't separate the human and the non-human, the technological and the natural. And, we can think about this in terms of, COVID, you can't disentangle it from its hosts, the air, droplets, surfaces, planes, doorknobs, laboratory environments, and then connected to other objects like PPE. And so they're co-constitutive in that sense. It's a mediating entity. And so the cut that I made and the examination was that COVID-19 had enacted a cascading network effect that coalesces around the toilet roll. It's become a centripetal object in an assemblage brought about by COVID-19. It has a kind of power. It has a kind of power in the way the material and the discourse, the meaning and the framing that we put onto it are mutually kind of implicated. It's a novel diffraction. It's a material semiotic object representing a whole host of fears, relations, and norms. And it's a kind of diffraction in that way. The agency of the object appears to have begun in Australia and spread by mainstream and social media to other countries, mostly in the West. Superficially, it's a bulky object whose absence is visually noticeable on store shelves. And that's one of the reasons why it might have taken on the meaning that it did. Because you walk into the store and you see an empty shelf and it's such a big, bulky object. It's made meaningful at the meeting point between things at each step, losing some properties and gaining others. Its usefulness is relatively straightforward. It acts as a necessary tool or technology of hygiene in the course of everyday life. The most obvious motive for hoarding it is the perceived danger of disruption to something on which we rely. It has an effectivity and an interdependence. It's important to note that the toilet roll only becomes anxiety-inducing when situated in a network of other human and non-human subjects and objects. In relation to panic buying, it's really interesting at doing some research. into how it mirrors some of the panic on Vicks vapor rub that happened during the 1918 Spanish flu, as well as the mass purchasing of salt during SARS in China. Drawing attention to the everyday practice of dealing with anxiety, we can see that it often includes forms of consumption and shopping, where certain items are deliberately avoided or favored. There's a lot of other work on pre and post disaster panic buying in relation to psychological and sociocultural motives, and the media, of course, as being a driving factor. I think the idea of cleanliness and bodily integrity is something that is really important. In a New Yorker piece, Henry Alford sort of talks about the purchasing of toilet rolls and what it reveals around citizen anxiety in our relation to bodily control. And just a quick quote, "Toilet paper is inextricably bound in our minds with defecation. It's one of our few public acknowledgements of it. Perhaps it makes sense then that a cafe in Australia recently decided to accept toilet paper as currency, 3 rolls for a coffee, 36 rolls for a kilo of beans." The activation of this ethos of cleanliness and regulation can be understood in relation to the other, proximity to civilization, conceptions of progress, and appropriate forms of embodiment. Phenomenological conceptions of the body as simultaneously discursive, material, and embodied, I argue. In times of stress and anxiety of fear, the maintenance of bodily integrity becomes a paramount concern. Bodily waste is seen as taboo, grounded in sociological behaviors that have evolved to deal with danger, a central feature of which is its untouchability. If a forbidden taboo is touched, be it involving a person or an object, both become taboo and untouchable. That sort of embodiment, really speaks to appropriate corporeal practices. Maintaining appropriate boundaries between the inside and outside is seen as essential, and left uncontrolled becomes manifest in feelings of disgust and fears of contamination. And it's more about culture than hygiene. Proximity to sex organs, another source of taboo and shame, taboos around menstruation, all of that comes to the fore as well. And it dovetails with gendered experiences of bodily integrity. I think it's also important, one of the other findings that I found is really the denigration of the body as a site of feminine unreason. Elizabeth Gross talks about this, and the management of volatile bodies, often female identified, that are encoded as out of control. And that regulation and its connection to the toilet roll is, I sort of put that in together with each other. The issue of otherness I really found as important as another part of that agential cut. It's mostly countries in the global north that experience these shortages, which speaks to larger issues of sociocultural norms. Hygiene practices differ in different countries. So I looked at bidets and water and cloths and these other kinds of cultural approaches to hygiene. And that idea of the imaginative geographies of contamination of different cultural practices and the disgust associated with the colonial other that is less amenable to self-government infuses this examination that I've made. A historically informed argument can be made that discrete acts of panic buying are partially constituted by a resurfacing of colonial imaginaries where relation to the other resuscitates long-standing race stereotypes and prejudices in sort of the perceived superiority of Western modernity. And that is associated with control over the body. Finally, it's worth noting that the toilet roll is also imbricated in material economic chains of production and consumption that reveals inequality of access, income, and knowledge. But that sort of is much more on the side of the mask. disadvantaged groups without the means to purchase necessities, low income or the retired, lacking information needed to source the right equipment if it's masks, exacerbates inequalities and leads to large portions of the population going without. There's no lack of supply, but it is really an issue of distribution. And just as a conclusion, the toilet roll, for me, it sort of was acting as this nodal technology within the assemblages of objects, human and non, relations, institutions, and structures. It's constituted here by the researcher's cut, producing a momentary stabilization such that once that cut is made, that chain of analysis can occur. And so COVID acts as this enacting instigator of these cuts, revealing myriad agential effects of technologies, and also media panics, the deification of hygiene. I talked about the concerns with bodily integrity, the resurgence of taboos, feminization of the body and neocolonial logics, and also this emphasis on inequalities of access. So it was overall, work that I'm planning to do more in, but it was a sort of way for me to work through and think about bodies and objects and what was happening at that particular point in time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tina, for a fascinating talk. I'm going to go straight ahead and introduce our next speaker, Sourav, who is having router issues or issues with his Wi-Fi. So we'll see if this works. We might have to turn off our cameras for it to function a bit better. So Sourav Kargupta, is a postdoctoral researcher in humanities, literary and cultural studies based in India. Currently an independent scholar, he has been a guest researcher at the German Research Foundation at the University of Freiburg in Germany from September 2019 to February 2020. Kargupta's PhD dissertation was on the philosophical and ethical aspects of the works of Gayatri, Spivak. In recent postdoctoral work, his focus has shifted to the recognition of a non-human turn at the intersection between post-colonial studies and critical post-humanities. His latest publication in a peer-reviewed journal deals with a key aspect of this broader project. He has also received, so the journal is called Parallax. He has also received an Erasmus Mundus postdoctoral fellowship to work at the Aarhus University in Denmark. So Sourav, if you want to share your screen.
Yes, I hope that you can hear me. And I'll now share my screen. Right. So can you hear me?
Yes, and see you.
Okay, I guess I really don't know how to put the slideshow on full screen.
If you just click slideshow and then from current slide, that should work.
From the beginning, right. Good, thank you. Okay, I hope this goes well. So thanks for that kind introduction, and thanks to the hosts for inviting me to be part of this truly transdisciplinary conference. And it really feels good to be part of the academic community again. And after listening to the recordings of the previous sessions, and I was really listening to them and learning a lot from them, of this wonderfully conceived conference, I feel that it might be better if I take some time to connect my argument to the general thematic of the panel, and indeed to the title of the panel, Bodies That Matter. And I would try to do that by first explaining A, what is non-human or deanthrocentric about my larger project, and B, how I engage with the work of Gayatri or this Spivak. Now, this paper is part of a broadly conceived project that I'm trying to piece together in the past few years. It covers 3 strands of thinking the non-human. One, as a non-human species, that is the animal whose privative otherness might be analogically similar to the silences and the privations of the sexed subaltern, Spivak's words. 2, the non-human technicity that both constitutes human language and pushes it beyond human intentional forms. And 3, as arbitrary witness to the finitudes of man. Now, in a recent publication in the journal Parallax, I have explored the problems of deploying the non-human in this 3rd register. In this article, I interrogate whether a historically located violence on the body of the gendered subaltern can be made ethically legible, where no normative or institutional frame can provide any clear or unbiased account. Then more recently, I worked on a project titled Gendering of Otium and the Prosthesis of Women's Writing in Selected Bengali Literature and Cinema at the University of Freiburg, in which the core idea was to map the resistances of the unavowed traces of sexual difference surfacing through the supplement of non-human technicity. So this project explored the 2nd strand, non-human technicity, marked in this text through the female protagonist's use of prosthetic devices, most prominently in their autobiographical writing. Now, the present paper continues my interest in the idea of non-human technicity as a supplement to agential intentionality, a non-human prosthetic materiality that, in Jacques Derrida's words, both, quote, constitutes and effaces so-called conscious subjectivity, unquote. Now, next section I call Spivak, value plus. I would now say a few words on the relevance of Spivak's method for my project and for the argument of this paper. Now, she names her method, quote, a practical deconstructivist feminist-Marxist position on the question of value in a narrow disciplinary context, unquote. Incidentally, in all cases, I'm using a different color to mark the stressed bits that I'm putting stress on in the slides that you can see. So what is this deconstructivist feminist Marxist position on value? And since we are discussing matter and materialism, I thought that a bit of Marx can't go wrong. Now, Spivak has a very unique reading of Marx's discussion of the value form to be found in the first section of Capital, Volume 1, a decisive bit of text that has spawned endless debate, as well as a series of critical tools of looking at the world of commodities, war and wealth, as Marx puts it. Now, the fact that Spivak inserts an interrogation of post-colonial and sexual difference within the textuality of value distinguishes her from the dominant grain of post-colonial scholarship. This dominant grain is based on the largely correct reading that the Marxist analysis emphatically presupposes that for the capitalist mode of production, it is necessary that the heterogeneity of all kinds of individual labor is translated without remainder into a homogeneous unit of socially necessary abstract labor. And therefore, Marx is inadequate as an analytic tool in reading the really existing affectively coded labor in most of the world, especially outside Western Europe. This reading is not false or wrong. However, Spivak's reading is radically different. She argues for a discontinuous Marx who leaves clues in his mature economic texts which indicate that such embodied heterogeneities do persist within the metamorphosis of capital as graphematic supplements that resist capital's autoappropriative itinerary. To this end, she argues that in the Marxian textuality of value, use value of human labor power, quote, remains both outside and inside the system of value determinations, unquote. In the context of the current dominance of finance capital, Spivak reads the affective supplement of gendered labor exploited at the fringes of capitalist mode of production as a persistence of material resistance of use value within the immanence of exchange. An uncontrollable rather than uncontrolled supplementarity, a resistance that she sometimes called permanent parabasis. Now, parabasis, as you know, is literally means a subversive digression. Parabasis originally meaning the songs sung by the chorus in Greek comedies. So she calls them permanent parabasis, this lingering bits and pieces of or the motley mosaic of use value that are not being translated to exchange value. Now, I would like to call this style of catching the supplement without reducing it, value plus, where the plus is deployed not in the sense of addition, but in the sense of a residual and withdrawal, much like what Derrida calls retreat. I guess this word is more French than English, but he uses it in the title of one of his pieces, which gets translated also as retreat. This, I argue, makes room for a certain resistant materiality of supplementarity. I remember, I think one of you were mentioning supplementarity in the previous session, in Spivak's work that fits well with the Derridian generic definition of materiality, that materiality is, quote, a very useful generic name for all that resists appropriation, unquote. Derrida also calls this quasi-machine-like materiality a materiality without matter. We might now read the following provocative comment by Spivak, quote, capital is not male, it is abstract and spectral, in the special sense that although bodyless, it must pass through unanticipatable moments of embodiment, carry codes with history, unquote. Elsewhere, she connects this with the Derridian trace, writing, quote, the working of the trace resists figuration. The impulse of the human is to turn the trace into sign. I repeat, because this is not in the slide. The working of the trace resists figuration. The impulse of the human is to turn the trace into sign, let's say economic value or gendered value. Therefore, it seems that if one wants to catch those unanticipatable moments of embodiment, it is not fictitious money or fictitious money capital or credit cards that one must appeal to, but to something that slips below and before such apparently non-human, but ultimately human coding. I mean the credit card and paper money and money capital. But we should appeal to something, Spivak says, that slips below and before such apparently non-human coding, resisting it through and through. But you might ask, where is body in all this? I end this note by mentioning that in an interview, when Spivak is asked by Ellen Rooney, quote, how is the problem of the subject related to the relationship between essentialism and the efforts to theorize the body or bodies? She replies, quote, the body, like all other things, cannot be thought as such. I do take the extreme ecological view that the body as such has no possible outline, unquote. Then she also adds, apparently contradicting her previous remark, that, quote, there are thinking of the systematicity of the body, there are value codings of the body. However, there is no contradiction here, for the systematicity of the body, say within economic or heteronormative coding, will always miss that which overflows these codes, a residual or withdrawal, as we have called it, a value plus that is both human value and excessive to that human coding, value plus. Now I come to my next section, which I called moment one from Spivak's corpus. Having made this preparatory journey, we now come to the main argument, staged within a juxtaposition of two moments from the corpus of Spivak. A, her critique, so I'll juxtapose two moments from her corpus, from her early writing basically. A, her critique of colonial cartography through a subversive reading of Martin Heidegger's The Origin of the Work of Art, and B, her much discussed account of the suicide of Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri in Can the Subaltern Speak? Now, in Rani of Sirmur, which was published in 1985, Spivak displaces Martin Heidegger's analysis of art's inscriptional breach to think the violence of colonial cartography that writes over the already pre-marked geographic space. The force of Spivak's clandestine displacement would be clear if we contrast it with a competing and well-known reading, that of Frederick Jameson. In his Marxist critique of postmodernism, in his well-known book, Frederick Jameson would like to translate the Heideggerian metaphors of art, Erde, and world, Welt, quote, as the meaningless materiality of the body and nature, that is earth, and the meaning endowment of history and of the social, that is world, Welt. Jameson is still within what I would like to call the first order constitutive coding of meaning, in which one has an epistemic access as if to that which is decidedly inert matter, body or nature, doing duty for Heidegger's earth here. Now, what Spivak does, on the contrary, is to mobilize what she calls her quote-unquote necessarily false analogy to bring this ontological talk down a notch to an ontic historical situation where the colonial project takes the world of the indigenous or local people as uninscribed earth to be worlded, to be written over. I call this, following Derrida's reading of J.L. Austin's speech act theory, a second order or referential coding of truth or meaning, since it is a certain wording or framing of truth, colonial cartography being its symbolic work here, writing over another world that pre-existed it. Most interestingly, Heidegger's use of the word der Riss in German, sometimes hyphenated as Aufriss, outline sketch, in its dual meaning of a cleft and an inscription, supports Spivak's cartographic analogy. In fact, a new translation actually renders der Riss as rift design to keep this dual sense. So I guess this supports Spivak's reading. A new translation does this. Moreover, for Heidegger, we must remember that artwork is only one origin of the setting to work of truth. There are indeed other ways of truth to happen, which includes, quote, the act of the founder of a political state, unquote, which again supports Spivak's post-colonial political displacement. Therefore, in her account, when a representative of the East India Company, Captain Geoffrey Birch, at the beginning of the 19th century writes in an official dispatch from the Northern Highlands of India that he wants, quote, to acquaint the people who they are subject to, for they were not properly informed of it, Spivak can run away with the Heideggerian metaphor, as it were, and comment that, quote, he is worlding their own world, which is far from mere uninscribed art, anew, by obliging them to domesticate the alien as master. Spivak's critique is not based on what she calls nostalgia for lost origins. On the contrary, her argument is precisely this, that what is being worlded is already a world worlded by a differently violent rift, framed within a series of second-order performative codings, that is Indian history maybe, that are no less human, right? However, the colonial cartographic or capitalographic worlding distinguish themselves in their epistemic claim of being originally human, and in their, quote, substituting colonized space as phantasmic art, unquote. Most indicatively, Spivak also does not forget to remind that this civilizing mission is part of the great anonymous, quote unquote, technique of capital. And I would like to actually read anonymous here as non-human, so the great non-human technique of capital, you might read it like that. Now I come to the next section. I now come to the second moment and try to read one of the most nuanced and enigmatic passages of post-colonial canon in the shortest possible time. This is the account of a suicide that Spivak inserts at the very end of her much debated and less understood essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, published in 1988, but originally published in a much shorter version in 1983. So she has been working on this essay throughout the 80s. I have to assume here that you are familiar with the piece in its broad outlines, because there's no time to go there. Shotidaho, if I may mention still in brief, refers to the violent ritual of widow burning banned by the colonial authorities in India in 1829 after an elaborate debate involving the indigenous elite and the colonial authorities. More recently, the sati debate has been re-examined by the Indian feminists, especially in the 1980s. Spivak's text is one of a series of feminist texts published in that time, in the 1980s. It argues, again in its broad outline, that in the case of the early 19th century debate on Shotidaho, the woman's voice is lost between, on the one side, scripturally sanctioned Hindu patriarchy, and on the other, colonial legality. Quote, between patriarchy and imperialism, subject constitution and object formation, the voice of the woman is lost. And then at the very end of a long text that also includes a critique of contemporary European intellectuals, namely Foucault and Deleuze, Spivak most enigmatically inserts a very short account that apparently has nothing to do with the Shoti debate. Therefore, it might help us to hear this story in her own words through her own, Spivak's own interpretative framing. And I quote, "A young woman of 16 or 17, Bhubaneshwari Bhaduri, hanged herself in her father's modest apartment in North Calcutta in 1926. The suicide was a puzzle, since as Bhubaneshwari was menstruating at the time, it was clearly not a case of illicit pregnancy. Nearly a decade later, it was discovered that she was a member of one of the many groups involved in armed struggle for Indian independence. She had been entrusted with a political assassination, unable to confront the task, and yet aware of the practical need for trust, she killed herself," unquote. The connection to the critique of the phallocentric accounts of Shotidaho is then made by Spivak, but without any extended argument. And this is why this is so enigmatic. Quote, "She generalized the sanctioned motive for female suicide by taking immense trouble to displace, not merely deny." She generalized the sanctioned motive for female suicide by taking immense trouble to displace, not merely deny, in the physiological inscription of her body, its imprisonment within legitimate passion by a single male. In the immediate context, her act became absurd. The displacing gesture, waiting for menstruation, is at first a reversal of the interdict against a menstruating widow's right to immolate herself, to be sati, that is. And according to the scriptural sanctions, the unclean widow must wait publicly until the cleansing bath of the 4th day, when she is no longer menstruating, in order to claim her dubious privilege, unquote, that is, of becoming sati. Sorry, I forgot to change the slide. Without what Spivak calls the displacing gesture, and therefore, crucially, without this interpretative displacement by Spivak herself, Bhaduri's suicide would become absurd. And yet, this gesture has a certain instrumentality about it, something to do with body's supplementarity exceeding the body beyond its normative framing, making it possible for Spivak to propose that Bhaduri, quote, perhaps rewrote the social text of sati suicide in an interventionist way, unquote. I now come to my concluding remarks because there is not much time left, I guess. I want to end by mentioning that one should, however, be very careful in this theory making, and Spivak is, to insist that the conceptual analysis is done with reference to an ethically figured singularity and not as an analysis of an quote unquote anthropological or historical exemplar. that might efface the individual who has to deal with the normative demands that restrict the gendered body, merely using her for philosophically elegant theory making. It is in this spirit that we might propose acknowledging the calculative nature of a proposition that restricts or economizes, that Bhaduri's exposure of our menstruating body to post-mortem verification, that Spivak reads as a, quote, reversal of the interdict against a menstruating widow's right to immolate herself, unquote, as Shoti, might be understood as a supplementary to agential intentionality. A material resistance to the proper legal determinations of sexual difference, a non-human prosthetic materiality both constituting and overflowing the normatively gendered corporeality. And yet, an aporetic gap, or better yet, a rift design, an Aufriss must be at play in the ethical call to which the feminist philosopher cannot not answer. As the setting to work of sexual difference that juts through the most normed archive, resisting, in Spivak's words, all formalization, precisely to come to us and to haunt us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sourav, for a fascinating talk. Can you stop sharing your screen?
Sure. Right.
That was great, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions, because I have to admit that some of your arguments went over my head. It was quite intense, you know. For art historians, having a purely philosophical talks like that is really, but it was great. Thank you so much. Okay, and I'm glad it worked. That was perfect. Okay, I'm going to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Lara Cox. Yeah, thank you for sharing your screen. Lara obtained her PhD on the topic of the theatre of the absurd from the University of Exeter in 2012. Her focus was on theorizing spectator positions occasioned by absurdist plays that enable modes of viewing consistent with queer and intersectional feminist social justice politics in contemporary times. This research became her first book, Afterlife of the Theatre of the Absurd, the Avant-Garde, Spectatorship and Psychoanalysis, published in 2018. Since her PhD, Lara has expanded her research from theatre studies to the wider fields of performance studies and visual culture, and she has also converted disciplines from French to English studies. Prompted by her move to teaching English in the French university system. She has published on the theatre of the absurd in Anglophone settings, notably Samuel Beckett's influence on Anglophone feminist performance art. Through her teaching, she's also developed an interest in the way intersectional and decolonial feminisms speak to the white-dominated mainstream. Her new research project seeks to establish a historical long view on the alliances between African American and white women in the history of American visual art, performance, and cinema. She's also in the early stages of developing a book-length project on decolonizing contemporary theatre processes, making use of her networks in France, the US, and the UK. Lara, whenever you want.
Thank you very much, and apologies, Sarah, for sending you such a long and wordy biography life story.
That was great.
Okay, so I just want to start by checking that everyone can see my screen, everyone can hear me. Yep, okay. Let me know if there's any connection problems or anything like that. I want to take this opportunity as well to thank Tina and Sourav for their fascinating papers. I think I should start by saying that mine slightly differs in its focus. Whereas the first two papers we heard were very much rooted in feminist theory, I am talking about feminism, but I'm moving into aesthetic practices and materiality rooted in aesthetic practices, and how that makes a comment on the intersections of race, gender, and class. So I just want to start by putting on my timer, so making sure that I don't run over drastically. I'll start by repeating the title of my topic, which is The Sculptural Paintings of My Artist in Question, who is Amy Sherald, a matter for intersectional feminism. And I recognized from the Sarah's slide that one of Amy Sherald's paintings, Grand Dame Queenie, was in the background of that slide, which I was delighted about. You'll see that painting as my topic goes, as my talk proceeds. So I just want to clarify that what I mean by intersectional feminism is feminist inquiry at the intersections of race, gender, class, oppression. And really in this paper, I will be focusing on how Amy Sherald's work promotes a complex and dignified representation of African-American women on the canvas. I was very attracted and enticed by the topic of this series of webinars on materiality because my artist in question, Amy Sherald, her work connotes a multiplicity of matter. Now, what do I mean by that? Just to show you 4 of her paintings here. So this is it. She's done many more paintings than this. But just to clarify what I mean by the multiplicity of matter, we see patterns emerging from Sherald's paintings. Generally, so she's known for depicting African-American subjects, both women and men, but I'll just be focusing on the women today, against brightly colored backgrounds in multi-hued, multi-patterned clothing, with a grayish tone which connotes and represents the skin. Amy Sherald has used the painting technique of grisaille, which is a technique whereby painting imitates the texture of sculpture. So when I'm focusing on matter, I'm focusing in this paper on both the role of clothing and that grisaille connoting stone. And I simply just want to pose this question, which kind of is the narrative arc around my paper today. How does materiality, so textiles and stone representing skin, in Amy Sherald's work assail power structures? I'm going to be dividing my talk into 3 parts. The first part will be focusing on textiles and clothing and how that promotes upward social mobility of her subjects in terms of class. I'm then going to be going on to a second part, which is discussing this sculptural quality of her painting and the creation of what I am terming deanthrocentric divas. And I'm taking that notion of deanthrocentric divas in that second part, and I am discussing that in terms of the circulation and reception of Sherald's work and how it promotes community uplift in reception in the final part. I would like to state as well that obviously I am very aware that I am, my positionality as a white woman reflecting on African-American representation and intersectional feminism, it's not neutral, and I do welcome comments on that, and obviously all of these interpretations, they are not neutral in that sense. Going to the first role or part of my topic, my paper today, and the role of textiles and clothing in Amy Sherald's portraiture. Amy Sherald has talked at length about the influences and inspirations on her artistic practice. And she's related to a certain degree her artistic practice to autobiographical experience. Notably, I just need to charge my computer. Sorry. Notably the fact that she was one of the lone African-American girls in a white-dominated setting. So she's Baltimore-based now, she's based in Baltimore, but she grew up in the south of the United States in Columbus, Georgia. She went through a white-dominated private schooling system, and she lived in a wider white-dominated community in Columbus, Georgia. Now, I just want to read out this quote that I have provided. I just want to, yeah, there you are. Because and analyze the role of textiles and clothing in relation to those autobiographical experiences that she recounts. So at times, I felt I had to prove to others that Black people are better than they thought we were. Acknowledging the performative aspects of race and Southernness, I committed myself to exploring the interiority of Black Americans. I wanted to create unseen narratives. So I think there's lots to draw out in this quote, and I won't have time to go into everything, but I want to focus on what I've underlined. That is the exploration of interiority, psychological interiority of Black Americans on the canvas, and how clothing contributes to that project, and how it also contributes to the creation of unseen narratives, which I'm interpreting as narratives that fall outside of stereotyping, pernicious stereotyping, controlling the bodies of African American women. So just going back to that slide where I showed you 4 paintings of Amy Sherald's work, we can see a pattern emerging of clothing taking center stage. Now, the women in the clothing tend to have shy, reserved, or understated gestures. So they might be delicately holding a teacup, clutching a cuddly toy, or clutching their clothes closer to their body in kind of a closed bodily gesture. I want to suggest that that sartorial centering enacts the move to psychological interiority that Amy Sherald describes in the quote I just gave you. This is an interiority that is not revealed. It's not the site of revelation or exposure, but interiority closed off from the viewer. So the body, its reserved gestures, the impassive stare, which doesn't give much away, all of those things don't give much away to the viewer. So it's an interiority that's closed off from the viewer. Sherald herself has described that each and every one of her subjects that she depicts on the canvas perform what she calls a quiet resistance. So their body and gestures may be understated, but they stare straight back at the viewer in defiance. They meet the viewer's gaze. So it's a quiet form of resistance. I want to suggest that via clothing, Amy Sherald's subjects, her women, dress themselves out of oppressive stereotypes surrounding African American women. Now, in order to demonstrate that argument, I just want to go to one example here, which is Welfare Queen, a painting from 2012. Which in its very name, in fact, connotes and indexes a pernicious stereotype surrounding African-American women. To quote Patricia Hill Collins on the Welfare Queen, and just to give you an example that I found, the Welfare Queen is, quote, a highly materialistic, domineering and manless working class Black woman. That's a quote. According to the stereotype, this pernicious stereotype, the Welfare Queen lives off the riches of the state. As we can see from this image that I've taken from the Netflix series GLOW, in stereotype terms, the Welfare Queen, her working class status might be signaled through that materiality, through clothing and accessories, so through the garishly coloured clothing that she wears, her flashy jewellery, which clearly signals fake gems rather than the authentic thing. Going back to Welfare Queen as depicted by Amy Sherald, we see something quite different emerging. So again, we see the subtle gestures, so clasped hands, hide behind more appropriate indexes of authentic wealth. So expensive looking satins, silks, pearls. So I want to suggest that this figure dresses her way out of the stereotype by donning more authentic markers and authentic materials of wealth. In that gesture, I want to suggest that Amy Sherald enables her subjects to access new social classes. So she enables this upward social mobility in terms of class. Sherald has talked at length as well about why she depicts her subjects in the clothing she does, and she cited one of the inspirations behind her work of the African-American portraits that emerged in great proliferation in the United States at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, in which African-American men, women and families performed this kind of classed respectability via clothing, which connoted material wealth and allowed them to distance themselves from connotations of economic deprivation and impoverishment. And this in a time where racism persisted in Reconstruction and Jim Crow America. Because Amy Sherald draws on that genealogy of this performance in African-American history of class respectability via clothing, we need to ask the question, is Sherald simply swapping black norms and stereotypes for whitened ones? Is she simply performing her subjects' longing for a whitened or white embourgeoisement? I want to suggest that the answer to that is no, and in order to develop on my response, turn to the second dimension of materiality that I'm exploring in my paper, which is the beyond human qualities of the grisaille form of painting, which marks the skin. So going back to Welfare Queen. So Amy Sherald has not always depicted her subjects' skin colour via grisaille and the grey hue. In fact, her breakthrough piece, which I'm not showing here, but you can look on her website, is entitled Equilibrium. It dates from 2012, and it was the first painting that Sherald became known for. And it was the first painting in which she committed to what she called the grey scale tone of her subject's skin. Now, the reason I say that Sherald is not simply swapping black norms for white ones is because grey is a symbolic mix of black and white. So there's a mix going on, not a loss. We can also identify this kind of performance of a beyond human status by looking at the art history of grisaille itself. So I'm just giving you one example of that. So grisaille was a form of painting that emulates the texture of sculpture and the color of sculpture, and it was popularized as a form of painting in the 14th century. In abbeys, churches, notably in Italy, and also in high-end, highly priced and valued manuscripts, such as this one, The Hours of Jeanne d'Oeuvre, the illustrations of which are by Jean Pucelle. As we can see in this manuscript, the figures, Pucelle manages to liquidate the boundaries between the body and sculpture via grisaille. Ordinary human figures in this manuscript, so street dancers, beggars, etc., approximate the immortality of sculpted figures. They also intermingle with allegory and saintly-like figures. So we can see an angel, we can see the Saviour as well. I think there is a similar move in Amy Sherald's use of grisaille. So her characters, I want to suggest, shed the proverbial mortal coil via this lapidary quality that allows them to approximate this art history of the depiction and the figuration of saintly-like figures in grisaille. We can see this most explicitly in the titles from paintings like Saint Woman from 2015 and Listen, You a Wander, You a City of a Woman, You Got a Geography of Your Own from 2016. And when I cite that latter one, I was thinking of a geographical wander, so her reference to a wander, geographical wander, and the sacralized status that we accord geographical wonders of the world. So Christie's keynote paper from last week showed us the extent to which colonialist art history has had a hand in its use of colour, in producing racialized identities, in producing race. Sherald herself has said that in depicting and figuring her subjects in this grey scale tone, she aims to decouple colour from race. But something else is at play as well. So I have argued that the sculptural and the semi-sacred is connoted by grisaille, and in that gesture, skin, human matter, becomes stone, non-human matter. And I think there is a parallel that I'm thinking through in African-American aesthetic traditions, which is not exactly the same, but there are echoes, and that's why I'm establishing a parallel here. Now, the parallel is described by Anne Anlin Cheng as an alternative tradition of diva photography and the representation of the African-American female diva. Diva, of course, connoting and etymologically stemming from the divine. In this tradition, we can see a similar de-anthropomorphization of the skin. So Anne Anlin Cheng, her work concentrates on Josephine Baker and Baker's studio photography from the 1930s, in which Josephine Baker set out to represent the skin as aligned not with human flesh, but with metals. So what Anne Anlin Cheng calls molten gold. Through a play really of contiguity between the lighting on Josephine Baker's skin and the clothing that connoted goldenness as well. We can see a later example of this aesthetic practice in something like Janelle Monáe's work. So Janelle Monáe, African-American queer artist, her 2010 album cover, The Arch Android, similarly establishes a contiguity between the golden city in stone and metal that sits atop her head and the lighting, the golden inflections on her skin, which again, I'm arguing contributes towards this de-anthropomorphization of the skin and a maybe surpassing of race in a certain sense via that move to the non-human. The question begs itself, what has this Deanthrocentric divahood got to do with assailing power structures? And I simply want to turn to the reception and circulation of Sherald's work in my concluding section very briefly. I want to suggest, as I said at the beginning, that Amy Sherald's work contributes to community uplift. In the creation of diva and quasi-deified sacralized African-American women on the canvas, Amy Sherald, I think, creates ideals and role models that her subjects copy. Notably, African-American girls have copied. So we can see here Parker Curry from 2018, who emulated Sherald's portrait of Michelle Obama for Halloween, and also Jasmine Callahan, who in July 2020 for her art project emulated Sherald's painting Miss Everything. And we can see that there is an imitation of Amy Sherald's work not via a copying of that grey hue skin, but via an approximation of the clothing on Amy Sherald's canvas. So it's via clothing that her subjects, African-American girls, copy the idealized identities they see on the canvas. Now, I want to suggest that there is a sense of uplift for these girls and a performance of ideal identities, and this maybe allows them to contest the forces of racism and sexism bearing down on them, that sociologists have noted through the pernicious stereotypes that surround African-American women and girls, contribute towards low self-esteem in African-American girls. They are performing a sense of uplifting idealized identity that they see on Amy Sherald's canvas. And just to conclude with my final point about reception of Amy Sherald's work and her production of what I'm calling cross-racial spaces via the grayscale tone we can see on the canvas. Grey hues has been a way for Amy Sherald to appeal to a gaze and to spectators across the races. I want to quote her here. As she says, there are a million other paintings of people who aren't brown. I think that's why my work, so rendered in grey, is so relatable to all different kinds of people. Basically, the grey skin tone is neither black nor white, and therefore it has allowed her spectators to see themselves, whether they are white, black, or other, in the work she represents. And in the move from skin colour to non-human matter, Sherald has attracted accolades and fans from across the races and genders. And I just want to show you a picture or a couple of screenshots from the inaugural event, which opened her most recent exhibition at the Hauser and Wirth Gallery in New York. To show how her work manages to produce this space of reception and enthusiasm across the races and genders. And I just really want to conclude with that point and suggest that Amy Sherald's work has this kind of universal, potentially, appeal, which forges alliances across the social divisions. And for once, this is a form of universalism not centering on white men, but according African-American women, a central place in that representation of universal humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lara. That was riveting, really. We're gonna open the floor for questions. So questions for our three speakers. Perhaps I can actually start, because I have one question for you, Lara, and then I'll open the floor. Sorry. I was extremely interested in your idea of the gray skin standing for non-human matter, becoming stone, becoming a sculpture. And it made me think about this post-structuralist reference that is Gilles Deleuze, who says in one of his conferences, so, le rocher, c'est là où règne le silicium, c'est le règne de l'inorganique. And he opposes silicium, that stands for rocks, to carbon, that stands for life. And so, compared to humans, you know, rocks are durable, immutable, their hardness suggests a certainty. You say solid as a rock. So I just wanted to give you this reference. I can actually, I looked for it in my notes, so I have it right here. I'm going to copy paste it in the group chat. But first, so my question, because this was more of a remark, is that have you found that in the works of other artists? Is this something that you, I don't know, linked to other?
I think that's a really interesting first of all, reference. So I'll be delighted to have the full details of that reference. I had never thought about rock as connoting the human. I had thought about the fact that sculpture connotes the kind of contiguity between the human and the non-human, in the sense that the hands mold the sculpture, etc. But that's a really interesting reference. In terms,
sorry, yeah, no, rock standing for the non-human. Sorry.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, he goes even further and says that rocks stand for new technologies too. He calls them third generation machines, that is computers, you know. Okay. So yeah.
Okay, sorry, I understood.
Sorry, no, maybe it was probably my
I think I put down carbon equals life. That's why I understood the
my mistake. Yeah. Okay, carbon. Carbon. Sorry, no. Carbon equals life. Carbon. That stands for the organic, and silicium, that stands for rocks. So
right.
Carbon,
okay.
Sorry. Yeah. Carbon equals life. Okay. Exactly. Okay. Sorry.
You can see the non-scientist in me.
Sorry. I mean, yeah.
I think that's my next line of thought, expanding this idea of Deanthrocentric divahood to other artists. In terms of other fine artists, I haven't found anything yet. Obviously, I cited those examples from performance, so Josephine Baker, from music, so Janelle Monáe. I had also looked at Diana Ross and the few films she's done, so musician, and I can't remember the name of her film now. But basically, there is this, one of the Motown films she did from the 1970s. There is this kind of establishment between, she plays the role of a fashion designer who wears very brightly colored clothing, and also her character, there is a line of continuity established between her character and the Roman statues she sees in the Italian capital. So I think I've been able to find similar echoes in popular culture, but not so much in fine art yet.
Great, thank you for a convoluted question. Sorry, yeah. Do we have other questions for our three speakers? Tina?
Question. Yeah, I had a question for Lara. Also, just in terms of, I was struck by like the beautiful kind of blackness of the images, and I was just wondering if there's a discourse around colorism that comes into this as well, where you have this idea of marginalization and the way that colorism intersects with that. Yeah.
I think absolutely Amy Sherald is playing and contesting that discourse of colorism through the grey rendering of her figures, absolutely. She has said herself that by opting for grey, not only does that appeal to a gaze across all races, but that works to decouple colour from race, and the art history that backs up that racist tradition, if you like, visual tradition. So absolutely, there's colorism playing into it, and a contestation of colorism as well. Thank you for your remark, and thank you for your paper. It was wonderful. I never thought I'd be put on a panel with someone who talks about toilet roll.
I think Sourav had a question.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? I'm not really starting my video as yet, not to put pressure on my Wi-Fi.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. So, so if I may ask you, Lara, first of all, thank you for that wonderful paper. If I may ask you something, even without knowing much about art history and more inspired by your wonderful paper, that like, how do you equate what you call the kind of quiet form of resistance that comes out of these artworks with what you described as a kind of longing that the spectators might feel for a kind of class mobility, because since the first, the quiet form is, if I may call it, a kind of, should be a kind of a subdued residual kind of element present in the artwork, whereas the other, the invitation for class mobility or identification should involve a kind of a more dominant kind of form of invitation that the artwork kind of throws out at you. And so how do you equate those two? And because here I also, and a kind of related question that I also have is what really, and this is also what interests me personally, do you think that one needs the necessary training looking at in looking at artworks, or necessary knowledge in art history to unpack that quiet resistance, and otherwise you're relegated to actually
It's a shame. Yeah, we didn't hear the final bit of your question, Sourav.
Yeah. Is he there?
Yeah.
No. I can answer what I think is going to be that last question. In order to interpret the artwork, no, I don't think you need that critical baggage at all. In fact, I think when I first saw Amy Sherald's work, from my position as white female spectator, which is a very, you know, my interpretations are my own, obviously, and someone else might have different interpretations. But I saw a kind of, and this maybe speaks to this idea of class longing and class upward mobility, I saw a satirizing of that in a certain sense as well. So I haven't shown the painting here, but there's one painting that I saw in the African American Museum on the National Mall in Washington, DC, where her subject, an African American woman, is dressed up in a kind of horse riding outfit with all the accoutrements, almost in a proliferation of those accoutrements, those bourgeois accoutrements. And I really saw a satirization of that. So I'm not so sure that she's only, or even if she is performing, a longing for classed upward mobility. I also think she's making a commentary on that as well, basically.
I mean, Sourav has left the group meeting, but he will be able to watch your answer, you know, because we'll post it. We'll post the video online, so no worries.
I had a question for Tina. Thank you for your presentation. I was interested to hear that you left sort of PPE aside for the purposes of your presentation, but one of the things that I was thinking of while listening to you was I was thinking of the contrast between those two objects in terms of who makes the objects available, or who manages these objects, you know, because I was thinking, well, while obviously a toilet roll is a kind of basic consumer product, when it comes to PPE, the management of that surely would involve the political establishment and governments. And I think that there was a lot that was said last year about governments sort of not ordering enough PPE, or, you know, getting rid of stock that they had from, you know, previous pandemic scares and so on and so forth. And so I was thinking, you know, that also involves, you know, hoarding on a different level, and it's politics at a, you know, on a different scale, because it's the political establishment rather than just the level of individual consumers. And so I was wondering whether in looking at those objects at the same time, or in parallel, you might have seen sort of parallels between those individual practices and the practices of governments, and if not, you know, how did you see those things relating or not relating?
Yeah, I found the global supply chain just the whole map is so convoluted and it's so politicized. So, I mean, there were things like for the toilet rolls, you know, a lot of people are saying, well, why can't we just take the toilet rolls that are coming from, you know, that can't be used in the restaurants because, you know, they're not using it because they're closed, and why can't we make that available for people? But then it was like, no, because the supply chain, like they won't, it doesn't fit on like, you know, home, you know, sort of holders. And then you do with the masks, what I found was really interesting was the fact that they did get rid of a lot of supply, just like, you know, within the past 5 years or so. So there's this idea of like, how are you prioritizing need and how are you prioritizing, you know, what is important, and the whole issue of the masks, also how they became a political object that was connected to, you know, making sure that there was enough supply available for medical professionals, but then not telling the public that you actually do need, you know, these, and people in you know, in South Korea and Taiwan immediately, you know, were like, no, we have to put masks on because it's going to, you know, be airborne. And so having that idea of where is it made, where is the quality control done, you know, having sovereignty over production, but not politicizing it in a way that would mean that you are saying that you don't, you know, that because they're made elsewhere, you know, asserting a kind of nationalism, you don't want to do that either. So all of that was, yeah, that sort of came, and it almost became an object that you could see through like a colonial lens. Yeah, so yeah, there was a lot there, and then also just getting into the economics of production and sourcing and who owns what and what corporations own what and how they use it for profit. Yeah.
Thanks, Lara. You had a question.
Okay, I have to remember to turn on my microphone. So my question is really going off of that for Tina, and a fascinating paper. So I wrote down at the beginning of your talk, so you were talking about loo rolls and face masks. I see, because I'm a performance studies scholar, I perhaps saw in those shortages and kind of the panic that surrounded them, sort of panic buying, this kind of performative aspect of public anxiety surrounding the pandemic. And I was just wondering, because toilet roll, if you like, I interpreted it as being disassociated entirely from the coronavirus, in the sense that toilet, it's not classically gastroenteritis or its symptoms. So toilet roll was really divorced from this curative purpose that face masks weren't at all. So I wonder if you could maybe talk about that and maybe link that to the cut and what you were saying about assemblages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way that I looked at it was that it was it was like the toilet roll was activated by the agency of COVID, and it was tied to this idea of anxiety. So in this like very weird assemblage, it was this cut that you had to make where it was, you know, you have this object that stands out and you're like, you know, why is this the object? And it just became this locus of anxiety. And you know, when you think about like the bodily integrity, I think that's where it came in, because it's this defense between the inside and outside and of hygiene, and that's what tied it to COVID. So that's what I thought. And then it, you know, there's also the issue of just panic buying, and you know, what's the one object that you could find that you have an issue living without. And then people started buying bidets, and there's this whole other thing of like, oh, like it's so kind of, you know, exotic to have like a bidet installed, and so everyone's talking about that, and then it, you know, becomes what are other practices of bodily control that you know, the West looks down on, and how is this an object of kind of progress and civilization that has led to so much, you know, environmental degradation. So it was all of that in this assemblage all kind of together, but I had to make that one individual cut in order to see it through that particular lens.
just going off of that as well, because you mentioned the Vicks vapor rub during the 1918 pandemic, and I think salt you talked about during SARS. Mm-hmm. Are those two objects more related to the curative kind of purpose than the toilet roll?
Yeah, I would say so. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have more questions? Perhaps I have one short empirical observation for Tina, actually. I felt that the shortage of toilet paper wasn't really happening in big cities. I mean, in my neighborhood, in my supermarkets, there was toilet paper, you know, and it was something that I was hearing from the shortage of toilet paper, but I felt it mostly happened. I don't know actually where I'm interested in the geography, you know, of this shortage. Where did it actually happen?
Yeah, when I was sort of looking at where large shortages were, they were mostly in suburbs. So like just outside of cities, and particularly where you would have big box stores like big Walmarts or Costco's and those kind of big stores that had a lot of supply. And it just seemed like just outside of the city centers, although there was, you know, a run on them in London, for example, and in New York City, I know that there was a run on them, and same thing in LA. And so I think in the States and in Canada, there was also in Toronto and Vancouver, in the city centers as well. But it seemed a lot of it was concentrated in just the suburbs that were just outside of city centers. And I think maybe that might be also a consequence of people having more room, because they tend to have bigger houses in those areas. So there's this sense of stocking up. And there's just a culture of stocking up, like, you know, going into a Costco and getting like a 5-kilogram thing of mayonnaise. Like, it's just one of those, you know, odd kind of things. So there's a bit of a culture of that as well.
Thanks a lot. Do we have more questions? Yes, Jan? Or
yeah, I have one that's sort of very wide-ranging, and probably, I mean, it might not make sense, but it's just if no one else has any more questions. I was wondering, and this is kind of on a pragmatic level. I was so interested to sort of hear the assemblage of how, you know, hear how all three talks sort of work together and sort of echoed each other when, you know, their points of focus were so different. You know, sort of you had that I felt that you sort of came at the matter of the politics of matter through, you know, the study of an object, an everyday object, through the study of art and how art sort of deals with matter, and through theory and sort of, you know, connections between theoretical, between strands of theoretical discourse. And so I was wondering how you three responded to that, how you felt in listening to the others, how you felt their talk sort of connected, and their take on matter and on politics sort of connected with yours.
I could start. I think of the idea of just the body and like the borders of the body and the materiality of the body and what it sort of signifies, and that idea of connecting the material and the discursive. That's something that I'm really, you know, trying to, that the you know, discursive turn and how that binary between the material and discursive, how can we deconstruct that binary? So it's not only what things signify and mean and how we inscribe meaning on bodies, but then also what the body does itself and how it enacts its own meaning and how it's felt and effective. That's something I'm doing in a lot of my other work, is just trying to find a way to talk about discourse and matter and affect and embodiment together, you know, as one. And that's what my focus on new materialisms is doing. So I think that, you know, for all of us, we're sort of but all talking about that, the signification and the boundaries and how we can sort of talk about bodies in those ways.
And just running off of that, so I totally agree. And I think that there is maybe something to do with the idea of the integrity of the body, closing off the body via the material object. So obviously Tina talked about that with the loo roll. I think maybe Sourav talked about that with the example of the case of the suicide from northern Calcutta. It's not the first time I've heard about that case. And it's a really interesting case, and this idea of the trace of the menstrual blood, leaving no doubt about the nobleness of armed resistance of the woman who committed suicide. And I think maybe my paper as well, the idea that clothing takes center stage, and therefore something about the body is closed off from very racializing and racist traditions in visual culture, maybe as well. So bodily integrity, I think, is maybe a thread as well.
Sourav, do you want to add something?
Yes, yes, I was also thinking, can you hear me? Because I'm now reconnecting from my phone. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So yes, I was also thinking that, yes, Tina's paper resonates with the kind of things I was getting at, because if I kind of retranslate her paper to my concerns, it would kind of boil down to the question, like, in this kind of crisis, the question really becomes which part of the body we want to cover, and what kind of supplement we don't want to, you know, proliferate outside of the body, and things like that, and exactly what material object which is socially kind of valid and permitted that we might want to hold up to actually look after the body if this crisis goes on for an indefinite period. So it's really about what Tina was talking about, exactly about marking the boundaries of the body and between the outside and the inside of the body, and who knows, maybe the way I was talking about value plus, who knows who knows if this kind of crisis continues, then maybe toilet rolls would take the place of paper money one day. Well, it's kind of a dystopic thinking, but you know, the possibility kind of flashed up at that moment.
It already has in the case of an Australian cafe, hasn't it? You were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of funny because that, you know, in a way, money as a kind of arbitrary object, it would make actually more sense to have something that has actual functional meaning rather than this, you know, paper money.
Thank you so much to all three of you. Just making sure, do we have any more questions? Because we're reaching the end of our session. Okay, I think we're done for today. So you know, before I let you all leave, I'd like to thank again, you know, from the bottom of our hearts, our three speakers who gave us, you know, such a fascinating sort of insight into bodies that matter, yeah, and thank you all, you know, who joined us from across the web today for this second leg of our webinar series on this connection between deanthropocentrism and the politics of matter. We very much look forward to continuing this conversation with you next week. Just a reminder that in case you missed last week's session, I think today was a very concrete reminder that technology fails us. It does happen. So in case you missed last week's session, or you know, something happened today, or you might not be available throughout the series, these sessions are recorded and they'll be uploaded and available for viewing online off of YouTube. And you can find the links on the webpage of our project, and I'm pasting that into your conversation now, so that and the name of the project is Humanities After Humans, right? So next week we'll meet at 2:30 French time for a session entitled Telling Matter, so a session on storytelling and narrative. And we wish you all a great weekend in the meantime. And yeah, thank you so much again, and see you all soon.
Thank you.
Again, bye-bye.